this is probably the most important thing to remember when you're looking to break into Asia. It's not one big nebulous market. You cannot have one brand plan or one marketing plan for Asia. It's not going to work. Each country is very unique and individual, and it needs you to look at it as an individual country when you go into marketing. These are some of the major factors affecting Asia wine markets today. We've got the health of the local economies. Currency fluctuations is a huge thing. I remember I used to work in Japan. I lived in Japan for about 3.5 years and worked there for about 5. But there's a lot of trends that come and go in Japan very easily. And as soon as the American dollar drops, suddenly California wines shoot up the market share. This happens in most Asia wine markets. They can be very fickle. And if something looks like a good deal, then they'll sort of go charging into that market, buy up a lot of wine that year. As soon as the currency flip-flops, then they just really easily drop that country. So currency fluctuations has a major effect. Varying and fluctuating taxes on alcohol. Asia, just all of the market seems to play this game with what's the tax going to be like this month or this year. And then we've got Hong Kong, who's obviously just said, let's just forget about that. Globalization and, well, the impact of globalization on Asia, constantly looking at the West. And usually one thing that hasn't also been mentioned is that wine is often used as a business tool nowadays in Asia. It's a badge not just of wealth, but of being globally knowledgeable about things. And so this is why, when Deborah said people are willing to spend such a huge proportion of their annual income on wine, because it's seen on educating themselves about wine, because it's seen as a ticket to doing business with the West. There's an increased availability of allocations of fine wines due to faltering US and EU markets. So this has really encouraged a lot of importers, top importers around Asian markets. Basically now, they don't have to buy through a third-party broker, because where the US and the UK and parts of Europe have really suffered due to the global financial crisis and given up a lot of their allocations, Asia's been there to pounce on them, and it's given them much more power than before to really sink their teeth into some fine wines. And investment opportunities, the auction scene, counterfeit wines. These are huge issues you'll hear about again and again in Asia. Deborah talked a lot about the auction scene. Wine investment funds seem to be springing up every single month in Asia, as do incidences of counterfeit wines, which is almost like a sort of taboo to talk about. Asians really don't like to lose face, and to admit that you bought a counterfeit wine is almost like losing face. So it's something that's being swept under the carpet now, but it's certainly going to be something that's going to come back to sort of bite the auction scene and those wine investment funds as well, for that matter. Okay, first one, Japan. Japan has a population of about 127 million people, and 27 million live in or around Tokyo. 98.5% are of Japanese origin. They're I like to think of them as very much so an island nation. And most of the population is Japanese because they've got very strict immigration laws and are not, how should I say it, they're not very embracing of bringing in foreigners and a foreign workforce, which is actually a huge problem because they've got a big problem with birth rate as well there. Roughly 11.8% of the population speaks English. Now that's actually not too bad. In Tokyo, actually, that figure is a lot higher than that. When you get outside of Tokyo, it's a lot lower than that. Almost no one speaks English outside of the major cities. You might get a few more people in Osaka and Sapporo, the big cities. but for the most part, it's very, very Japanese. All Japanese kids are brought up learning English in school. They actually know a lot of English, but they're very shy about speaking to foreigners in English because they're afraid they're going to get it wrong. They really, really do not want to get anything wrong. They're absolute perfectionists. Okay, so I'll start by talking a little bit about Japan wine market opportunities and challenges. One of the first things I was going to mention is that's actually a vineyard that's used to make wine in Japan. You can see a lot of grape bunches hanging overhead from a pergola system. And then if you look very closely, you can see just to the left-hand side, or your left-hand side of that screen, there's a tree. That's one vine with all those bunches on it. And those are Koshu grapes. That they do make wine in Japan, and they do make premium wine in Japan, and it's usually from this grape variety, which is Koshu. It's a pink-skinned grape that makes a white wine. This is when I started out in Japan, this is how they used to make it, from these trees that are actually designed for table grapes. And they used to make pretty awful wine out of them. Nowadays, I've worked on several projects in Japan to make VSP vines, or vertical shoot position vines, much lower yields. These vines are actually virused with leaf roll. So the vineyards have been taken away from this area just to outside this area. This is Yamanashi outside of Tokyo. And it's been brought to another area where the vineyards or the soil is free from any virus. And they're making, if you've ever had a chance to try it, much higher quality Koshu wine than ever. Now, why I mention this, there are about 200 licensed wineries now in Japan, which probably seems pretty amazing to you. Well, I was pretty amazed to hear you only have about 256. I thought, oh my gosh. Most of these wineries are tiny, though. And they're important because they're helping to expand the wine market in Japan. Why? Because the Japanese are more embracing of things that they can do well as well. So, for example, baseball is now very big in Japan. They didn't even pay attention to it until they had their own baseball team. Anything that they can do and do well, they're much more embracing of in their own culture. So now that the Japanese can sort of hold their head high and export Koshu wines around the world and feel proud of them, it's made them even more excited about learning about wine and importing more wine. Some of the opportunities in Japan, it's a relatively mature market by Asia standards. It's probably the most mature in all of Asia in terms of wine education. There's a very strong demand for wine education and for wine literature being translated into Japanese. So, for example, when I was working there, I used to work as a wine buyer for a wine importer, a premium wine importer in Japan. And on the weekends, I used to work at the biggest wine school that they have in Tokyo, called the Academy du Vin. We had thousands of students every year. It was quite incredible how many we would have. And I just thought I'd throw out there that most of my students were actually female. Women are incredibly interested in learning more and more about wine and being sort of wine, being able to speak eloquently about wine. It's technologically advanced and very embracing of new trends. As an example of this, Starbucks, which is quite popular in Tokyo, tests out all of its new products in Japan because they know that the Japanese are far more embracing than most countries. And if it doesn't work in Japan, it's not going to work anywhere. About 60% of the premium wines are consumed in or around Tokyo. So if you are focusing on Japan as a market, really good to at first at least go for somebody who's very strong in the Tokyo area. They have an excellent wine range and highly competitive pricing. Now, the taxes in Tokyo or in Japan are amongst the lowest in Asia. They're certainly lower than the United States or the UK, for example. And actually now, since 2002, they had a big change in the licensing laws. So nowadays, just about anybody within any area of Tokyo can get a license to sell alcohol. And that's really opened up the wine market a lot.